Allow me to begin this review with a question. Are video games art? This is a question that attracts a lot of debate, as it has done for a good couple decades now. And depending on who you ask, you will get many different answers, ranging from all games are art to video games cannot be art, with various explanations and justifications for such positions. For my money, I argue that video games are in and of themselves an artistic endeavour, in spite of concerns such as profit. Games are a combination of many artistic disciplines. They generally make use of code, sound effects, music, textures, 3D models, and often the written word as well, for things like story and dialogue, with every one of these elements made up in one way or another by a person or group of people. I ask this question because we're about to delve into a couple games that could very easily be argued in some way to be of considerable artistic value. Whilst it might not be enough for people who argue that games cannot be art, I don't think it's unreasonable to ask that they look at what these games do and consider seeking artistic value within, because in my opinion, they have a lot to offer. Before we delve deeper, however, I want to begin with a discussion on somebody who came into video game development from a background in art. Whilst he isn't as well known a game designer as Hideo Kojima or Hironobu Sakaguchi, for example, that doesn't impact his impressive game design nous in the least. Let me introduce you to Fumito Ueda. In 1993, Fumito Ueda graduated from Osaka University of Arts, an institution with a venerable list of alumni, from illustrators such as Kiyohiko Azuma, Range Murata and Masamune Shiro, directors such as Hideaki Anno, Kazuyoshi Kumakiri and Nobuhiro Yamashita, and to bring it back to video games, a substantial chunk of the Nintendo Dream Team, including but not limited to Yoshiaki Koizumi, Koji Kondo and Yoshio Sakamoto. With his education in hand, realising that working as a visual artist would likely not be enough to pay the bills, and having an interest in computers after buying a Commodore Amiga post-graduation, he found employment at a game development studio called Warp, where he worked on the 1996 Sega Saturn title Enemy Zero as an animator. In interviews, he referred to his time at Warp as being arduous, as the amount of work was quite steep, and given Enemy Zero was released only a year after the PlayStation version of the team's previous game D, it proved to be quite intense, leading Ueda to move on to joining Sony Computer Entertainment not long after. It was at Sony that he devised a project that was planned for the original PlayStation, starting with a simple animation in Lightwave that would turn into a full production within Sony. But whilst the game was showing promise, it took 2 years for the realisation to come to pass that the PlayStation was making things difficult, as the system's computational power was bottlenecking the game's design and animation work. However, in September 1999, a breakthrough was unveiled to the world: the PlayStation 2. Plans were made to convert the game to the new hardware, which came with the benefit of overcoming the processor hurdle, but it also came with a few issues of its own, primarily the increase in resolution, making it so that there was nowhere to hide as far as the visuals were concerned. It may have taken 4 years to go from conception to publication, but in September 2001, North America, followed by Japan in December and Europe the following March, would finally see the release of a curious take on a genre that doesn't get that much attention. This is Eco. Eco is a 3D action platformer that sees you playing as a boy called Eco, navigating your way out of a prison along with a mysterious girl, all the while being accosted by strange dark beings whose goal appears to be the abduction of this girl. It's a game that wears its influences on its sleeve. My mentioning Ueda purchasing an Amiga after graduating from university was no offhand comment, as he primarily looked towards classic cinematic platformers, such as Another World and Flashback, for inspiration for this game. Eco serves as something of a landmark for 3D platformer design, as its slower, more deliberate pace enables the game to pursue a sense of realism. A magical realism, to be sure, but there was purpose in it by trying to make the game feel like you're worming your way out of an impossibly large castle. On its release, Ico was highly praised by critics, discussing the impressive visual direction and animation, as well as having clever puzzle design, and the sense of companionship that builds over the course of the game. But some deemed its length, which stands at around 7 hours, to be short, that the game's design limited its replay value, and that the game's combat system was seen as lacking in depth. Despite those few criticisms, Ico reverberated throughout the video game industry, with many top developers taking inspiration from the game, be it with general concepts such as designing by subtraction, or even something as simple as how you save your game. Publications and developers alike shared a great admiration for this game, but in terms of sales, it struggled to shift all that many units for a first-party Sony game. It sold around 700,000 units, the bulk of the sales being in PAL territories, and there were a number of reasons for this, one of which we'll get into right away. You know what's coming, so let's talk about the game's packaging. If you're in the PAL or NTSC-J territories and you had this game, you saw this rather striking cover. It was drawn by Ueda himself and takes inspiration from the work of Italian metaphysical artist Giorgio de Chirico. In particular, the nostalgia of the infinite and the melancholy of departure can be seen as being especially influential on this piece. It's a fantastic cover art because there was simply nothing like it at the time. It gives you a great idea of the scale of the game, as well as alluding to several concepts that will feature within. It also helps that the logo feels complementary rather than distracting. It's in the corner, but it's big enough that you can see it. So naturally, the North American release had to have an abysmal cover art instead. The sense of scale, the mystery, the surreal perspective of the other box art, and the restraint in its composition were all blown to the wind with a visual design that would look mortifyingly embarrassing on the cover of an early 2000s pulpy fantasy novel. What is there to even say about it? The glazed over character models simply do not work here, and just present an overwhelming feeling of the uncanny valley, something the original cover avoids by having the characters being small. Not so small that they're unrecognisable, but small enough that the scale of the environment reflects on them as if to swallow them whole. Being hand-drawn helps too. Developers have cited the North American cover art as one of the reasons behind why Ico failed to breach 1 million units on the PS2, and I wouldn't disagree. It's really hard to say what the idea behind the North American cover was, because it completely fails to sell the game in the unique way the other box art did. Anyway, that's enough rambling about the front cover, so we'll look at the back. And there's something about this composition that just feels right. Our main cast stand near the edge of a cliff, hand in hand, whilst the foreground elements of the rear cover explain a few things about the game. There are also a few small screenshots that show what the game is about. As for the contents of the box, we have the game on a CD, and we have a manual. Looking inside the manual, we see that it's set out in a somewhat unusual way. Instead of the instruction manual tradition of dry, dense technical writing, you get something more akin to a storybook, with large text accompanied by expressive illustrations to provide further context. There are manuals that make an attempt to differentiate themselves from the usual, often by turning their manual into a comic book, or by being printed in a more thematically coherent way. But the way in which this particular manual is set out is in itself indicative of the kind of game we're going to be covering here. Before moving on, I do have one thing I want to say. The packaging takes great pains to not name the girl, simply referring to her as Shoujo, or the girl in English. But then in the credits section, it names her. I guess we just spoiled Yoda's identity before we started the game. I've no idea how other releases handled this, and we're not about to find out because we're about to get going with this review of Ico. Upon loading Ico, we are greeted with an in-engine cutscene showing a group of people riding on horseback, including a boy with horns on his head and his wrists bound together. The camera soon pans away from the group and we are overwhelmed with a misty brightness as mysterious ambient sounds play before the camera comes to rest on a scene showing a castle in the background and the main menu on the foreground. Wait a few seconds, however, and a movie will begin to play, showing off a few cutscenes and some example gameplay that will appear in this game later down the road, all presented with lush acoustic music for the backing track. For now, however, we should begin the game proper. Set wherever you want vibration, and we can begin playing Eco. Another cutscene plays, where we see a group of people in the starting sequence now on a boat, heading into a cave and docking. After disembarking, one of them requests a sword, which we see being used to open a sort of statue door that lets the group access an elevator. Ascending it and using the sword to exit the elevator, we find ourselves in a massive chamber filled with ornate sarcophagi. One of them opens up and the boy Eco is placed inside it. It then closes, sealing him within. The room then shifts to seal the chamber up, and Eco notices things aren't stable. He tries to throw himself around with what mobility he has, and the sarcophagus dislodges itself from its perch, opens again, and spits Eco out. After hitting his head on the ground from being thrown from the sarcophagus, Eco dreams of ascending a long spiral staircase, where at the top is a large cage with a black fluid oozing out from it and falling to the bottom of the tower, with a silhouette inside the cage itself. Eco soon after gets dragged into a shadowy hole in the wall, before waking from this nightmare and gets on to working out how to leave this place. So now to go over some of the controls here. To start out, the left analog stick moves Eco. What's worth noting, however, is that movement control is relative to the camera, so you may need to adjust where you're heading sometimes. The right analog stick controls the camera. As camera systems go, it's awkward but not unusually so. It comes from an era where Japanese games hesitated to include a player-controlled camera due to motion sickness concerns, although the manner in which this game's camera works is still strange. You can pan and tilt the camera to look around and see what things might be of note, but it can take a few seconds to reach the limits to which they can be panned. Once you let go, it will similarly take a few seconds for the camera to return to center on Eco. Of the other movement controls, jumping is performed with the triangle button, and you can perform a running jump to gain a bit more height. You can also jump to grab onto certain things that enable further traversal, such as ledges and chains. On chains you can scale, descend, or turn around on them with the analog stick. You can also swing on the chain to build momentum if you hold the circle button down and jump off with the triangle button again. Sometimes you want to drop down from a height, either by dropping from a ledge or coming off a ladder or a chain, and the way to do that is with the X button. If you want to mount a ladder, you can press the circle button, and the circle button is also used to interact with things such as levers, boxes, and other furniture. With these controls in mind, we practice using them to make our way up the tower that Eco saw in his nightmare. We again see the cage, but instead of a black, vaguely human-shaped blob like we saw in the nightmare, we instead see a girl, sat on the floor of the cage with her knees to her head. Eco calls out to her, but the girl doesn't respond. We keep scaling what's left of the tower, eventually reaching a lever which allows us to lower the cage to the bottom. We run back down, but find that the cage is still inaccessible, as it hangs over the floor. Not to worry, we just jump onto it and use our combined weight to break it off its chain and open the cage. The girl steps out of the cage and speaks in a language that Eco doesn't seem to understand. He tries explaining himself to her, but it's clear that she doesn't understand him either. It isn't before long, however, that some strange shadowy creatures emerge and try to take her away. Once Eco gets back on his feet, control returns to us, and we have to save the girl from being snatched. Simply, we grab a stick and beat the monster until it dissipates into nothing. We talk again with the girl, again a pointless endeavour, before taking her hand when we press the R1 button. This, right here, is the moment where the game ends its abstract and moves onto its thesis proper. The game is built around the interaction between Eco and the girl, unable to communicate verbally with any actual depth, but able to hold hands. And now, with that hand-in-hand connection, you can work together to get out of the castle in the mist. After running towards the statues in the back, the girl seems to be able to move them to open up a passage that leads out of the tower. And as we exit, we find something unusual. A stone sofa that lights up as we approach it. This is your save point. Sit down on the sofa with the girl and you can save your game. After finishing our legally mandated coffee break and dramatically avoiding falling from a great height, we open up another statue door that leads into a small chamber with a few different things in it. But as we go down the steps towards the door on the other end, the creatures come back, and we're given an encounter that we have to deal with. We'll get into the combat later since that's a whole other thing. Something else I'll cover in more depth later, given it's quite the cornerstone of this game, is the environmental puzzle solving, which you'll come to grips with in this game fairly early on. We eventually find ourselves approaching a gigantic open gate, seemingly our way out of there. But unfortunately for us, it begins to close shut almost as soon as we see it. Running to it, the girl stumbles and the gate closes, ensuring that we won't be leaving anytime soon. Another being suddenly makes her presence known. The Queen. She speaks first to the girl in her language, naming her Yorda, before talking to Iko in his language to tell him Yorda's her daughter, that he should leave her alone and demands he leave this place. Weren't we aiming to do that anyway? Well, whatever. She dissipates, but whilst Iko checks on Yorda, the Queen briefly speaks in Yorda's language before leaving us to our devices. So now that we've had a confrontation and the gate is shut, we have our objective. Find a way to reopen the gate and get out of here. This is something that will no doubt take some time to sort out, but we've got plenty of it to figure out how to do that. So whilst that's going on, let's talk about the combat. The combat in Iko is simple. Almost comedically simple in fact, as though it was designed in such a way as to be as unintrusive as possible, but still have something of a presence due to the stakes at play, and as a consequence, it feels like the weakest link in the chain for this game's design. Okay, I'm jumping ahead a bit here, so let's pare it back. In certain areas you will encounter the shadow creatures whose objective is to kidnap the defenseless Yorda, and your objective in those situations is to prevent them from doing so by beating them with something with the square button. Early on it'll be with a stick, but later on you can get access to swords that deal more damage. The enemies you encounter will vary quite a bit in terms of what they do. You get spider-like critters that serve more as distraction fodder than as actual enemies, alongside enemies that can sink into the floor to dodge your attacks, others that can deal some fairly hefty blows to keep you down, and others that can fly about to make them hard to hit. There are a few observations I have with this combat system. Firstly, the combat itself isn't exactly challenging. You just swing your weapon against the enemy and it'll probably connect, so long as the enemy isn't doing some sort of dodging manoeuvre. One fairly neat aspect is when several enemies are close by, you can hit multiple enemies in one swing to make the job of dealing with these things a little less painful. Somewhat like the Resident Evil 4 kick knocking down a wave of enemies. It's quite cool. However, for as neat as that is, I find myself swinging and missing more than hitting, as the enemies just keep running around, sinking into the floor, hopping over me, hopping back, and just generally being really annoying to deal with. I don't like it much. With that said, one other observation I have with this game's combat is, well, Iko doesn't have a health bar. Hits don't deal damage and instead just knock him back and stun him for a second. On the one hand, this can make an already oversimple combat system feel even less worthwhile. You can't be killed in combat unless by misadventure. On the other hand, Iko himself isn't the target in these combat situations. Yorda is. Iko not having a health bar and instead being stunned by enemy attacks opens Yorda up to being snatched, since Yorda cannot defend herself. In the event that they do grab hold of Yorda, they will take her to one of the holes they came from and drag her down into it. At this point, you're on a timer. Get over to Yorda and drag her back out of the hole before she is overwhelmed and gone forever. The things I mentioned regarding Iko's combat aren't themselves inherently bad or anything. I think the main reason I think is the weakest link is probably that it feels too easy for the most part. Whilst I would prefer too easy to too hard, it's clear that the combat wasn't designed to be deep or complex, just present. It's fine, just not on the level of other aspects of the game. This game is a good bit better as a 3D puzzle platformer than as an action game. It's pretty smartly designed where puzzles and platforming are concerned, and whilst there are a couple awkward spots, it does a solid job of making the player feel clever for solving environmental puzzles and navigating the gigantic castle. From early on, you'll be climbing up and down chains and ladders, jumping all over the place and pushing blocks, all the while running around with Yorda's hand in Ico's own. If you've played basically any 3D platformer of the last 25 years, you should be somewhat familiar with the mechanics shown. Different kinds of puzzles you will encounter tend to be fairly simple ones, such as picking up a bomb to place at something like a boarded off doorway and lighting the fuse, or manipulating levers to move things around, or setting things up to allow further progress, such as turning off the flow of water. There are puzzles where several things combine to form a greater challenge. For example, the closed gate has two large puzzles for you to solve to open it. Each of these puzzles has smaller puzzles within, such as lighting sconces that need to be opened, and in doing so you learn to make use of new mechanics that can come into play later on. They're smart puzzles, but this is where I talk about one issue I have. Before I begin, I want to say at no point did I look up a walkthrough, which can sometimes happen when I'm playing a game like this and don't know what I'm supposed to do. If I can play this game and figure things out, then it's surely not all that bad for telling you what to do. And it's true, it's pretty good at telling you what you're meant to do. Anything that glows at least a bit or looks like a statue door will involve Yorda, so you'll need to guide Yorda to these things. However, there are times where you can do something and it can feel like you're making no actual progress. For example, there's one room towards the second gate tower where there is a unique feature, an engine that requires being powered up. To power it, you need to climb up a ladder, shuffle along rails and pull a lever. You need to get down from there, and now make use of the platform that plunges and springs up using the engine's power, and use it to jump to reach the ledges at the top. Sounds fine, right? Well, this was very nearly a roadblock for me, and this room kept tricking me into false flags. For example, there are two holes in the ceiling, with one of those holes being by one of the rails along the ceiling. On top of that, I tried to figure out what to do with the platform, where you have to jump in order to reach the ledges at just the right time, but for whatever reason I couldn't get the timing right. Also in this same room is a secret room hidden behind a wall that can be turned around. I only found this because I was desperate and thought I'd look around the room, push and pull some stuff, see what happens, and I don't know what this room does. What's this brazier thing? What's this big window? What is this room? I really don't know. What I can say, however, is that even though it took me about 50 minutes between starting up that engine to finally getting up to the ledge, and even though I spent time with things that seemed entirely inconsequential to what I was supposed to do, at no point would I say that I got horribly frustrated about this. A little annoyed perhaps, but I have played games where I spent way less time on certain things that bothered me far more negatively than this. A couple things about the traversal I do want to mention concern Yorda actually. Every once in a while you might want to go into another room where Yorda can't enter, or you want to do something quickly without needing to wait on her climbing up a really long ladder.
What a thrill.
You need to be careful however, because if you cause a transition to load for a different area to where Yorda is, you will need to finish whatever you're doing quickly because Yorda will get snatched if you leave her alone for too long. There are also times where Yorda can be quite helpful. If you're in an area for a while, Yorda can sometimes indicate that there's something you need to do. It's not always obvious what you ought to do, and it's not something that she does frequently, but often you get an idea of what she wants you to do based on where she is, what she points to, and so on. For now, I want to go into the presentation of Ico, which I think is one of the big identifiable aspects of this game. Normally I cover the visuals first, but for this review I'm going to start with the audio work, since the audio side can serve as the entree to the main dish that is the graphics. So for the sound work, there is an impressive clarity to a lot of the audio. The subtle things like the crackling of fire, the shuffling of Eiko's sandals, and the sounds that play when Eiko swings a weapon and it connects, all have a nice clarity to them to help sell feedback to the player on things. The sound effects of the shadow creatures are also really cool. There's a murky, almost fleshy quality to them when they hunt you down and you bonk them over the head with a stick. Often there will be an ambience that can be quite eerie or even haunting, with rooms that can be echoic to give the impression that you're in a gigantic enclosed space. That said, the breezy outdoors can have a soundscape of their own, that can make you feel almost isolated, reminding you that you are, as a matter of fact, trapped in a castle disconnected from the land from which you came. So with the environmental and incidental sound effects accounted for, let's talk about the voice acting. With the characters at the start of the game going uncredited, the main characters of Eiko, Yoda and the Queen have voice actors behind them, with Kazuhiro Shindo, Rieko Takahashi and Misa Watanabe respectively. If there's one thing you might notice about this voice acting, it's that what is said doesn't match what the subtitles say. That's because Fumito Ueda's games make use of what can be best described as a deliberately mangled form of Japanese. Syllables will be flipped, words will be ordered in weird ways, and everything will sound different enough that you simply need the subtitles to be able to understand what is being said. Eiko does go a step further in this regard, however, by changing things enough that it uses wholly different subtitles for Yoda to stress that both she and Eiko cannot understand one another verbally. As far as the game's soundtrack is concerned, composed by Michiru Oshima, Koichi Yamazaki and Mitsukuni Murayama, it doesn't have a particularly massive track list. Or more accurately, there are only a few tracks that are more than incidental sweeps. According to the soundtrack CD, there is not even half an hour of music here, although that doesn't include many of the stings used. The presence of a soundtrack CD, however, is enough for me to say that what music Eiko has is very good. It's rare you'll actually hear music in-game normally, as the sounds you hear are more from Eiko, Yoda, whatever machinery is nearby, and the enemies that decide to upset the peace. Really, the music appears much more readily in cutscenes, when you're saving the game, or when you've died and you need to restart. The save music is quite nice and comforting. It's the sort of thing you want to hear when you're taking a break. On the other hand, the oddly contemplative nature of the game over screen's music makes you think, well, that didn't go to plan at all, let's see if I can do something different this time. There are two tracks on this soundtrack in particular that I would consider to be especially noteworthy. Castle in the Mist is the first of the game's two main themes. It's an unusual track, but one I really like. It has a 3/4 time signature and has a very folky feel to it, and it's oddly catchy. The second theme is Eiko, You Were There, and it differentiates itself from the other tracks by having vocals courtesy of Stephen Geraghty, who was a chorister and a member of Libera at the time. The Millennium-era pop aesthetics of the intro, combined with Stephen's voice, combined to create something pleasant to listen to. I do find myself preferring Castle in the Mist, but both tracks are excellent. I'm not sure what's going on with the mishmash of the sound effects on the track's opening and closing though. It's a bit odd. So now we move on to the visuals, and for all intents and purposes you could write an entire academic paper on the visual design of this game. It's so thickly layered that it's hard to really talk about everything in a single review without spending an inordinate amount of time on it, but I'll go over some key bits. Firstly, a technical detail that's really unusual for a PlayStation 2 game for the time. Whilst most PS2 games run by default at 480i, Eiko runs at a resolution of 512 by 224 pixels, or 240p. This may be a legacy of the game originally being planned for the PlayStation 1, but it does give the game an unusually low resolution look to it that's charming, if a little hard to pick details out in. As far as the frame rate is concerned, it's hard to get a read on what exactly the frame rate is intended to be, since it tries to be around 60 frames per second, but seriously struggles to hit that with any measure of consistency. Still, it's not particularly horrible at least. With the technical details out of the way, I want to talk more about the visuals themselves, and we can start by saying that Eiko and Ueda's later games have a very distinct look to them. To put it another way, you know a Fumito Ueda game when you see it. There is a lot of masonry and stonework, as one might expect being in a castle, but there's also a lot of things in the game that you could almost describe as tribal if you wanted to. The clothing, the sarcophagi, the statuary, and even the design of some of the machinery can look like it belongs to a different kind of culture entirely. It's an interesting, almost anachronistic mishmash of different things, and I quite enjoy it. Perhaps the thing Ico's visuals are best remembered for, however, is bloom. If you've played games from the mid-2000s especially, like The Elder Scrolls 4 or Oblivion, you'll know what bloom is from seeing it. It's an effect that makes the lighting in this game exceptionally bright, especially when you're outdoors where the sun mixes with the mist to bathe the whole castle in light. However, this bloom effect serves a double purpose. Not only does it make the game's environment look extraordinarily bright, but the effect is also used on Yorda, enabling her radiant skin and clothing to make her stand out against even the bright and vivid outdoors. You won't fail to spot her when you're trying to find her, that's for certain. The lighting also helps to make the shadow creatures stand out in perfect relief against the otherwise vibrant environment, to give the game an almost too obvious contrast of light versus dark. If there's one thing this game's visuals handle well, it's contrast between light and dark. That having been said, there is doubtless the possibility that someone playing this game for the first time might find the brightness of the game to be perhaps overwhelming. Whilst I don't think it's too bad, I can very easily imagine someone getting dazzled by it if they weren't expecting it to be so bright. With the above taken into consideration, however, the thing I love about this game more than any other is the incredible sense of scale this game presents. Everything is really large. Large interiors, large courtyards, large towers, a really large gate with a comically large bridge. The scale is excellent. And perhaps the best thing about the scale of things in this game is it's not a chore to navigate. You move at a brisk pace and the chances are good that if you can see it, you could very probably reach it somehow. Ico is also a very impressive animation showcase. At a time where motion capture was becoming popular since it first started being used in the 1990s, the game instead makes use of handmade keyframe animation. The reasons for this included the comparative smoothness when transitioning between animations. You don't have to wrestle with as much information with keyframes compared to mocap. The smoothness of the animation is really good for the time. A lot of games of the era can have a somewhat stilted look to them, but the game gets around this problem by having very smart keyframing and knowing when to go between different animation states. It's possible that the animation is the big reason for why Ico went from the PS1 to the PS2, because this level of smoothness would play havoc with the PS1's meagre hardware. Moving the game to the PS2 enabled the game to look this good, and cutting it down to somehow make it work on the PS1 would probably have been a mistake in the long run, as impressive as it would have otherwise been. One last aspect of the game I want to talk about now relates in part to the visuals. The user interface. Or perhaps it might be best to refer to it as the lack of a user interface. I touched on this earlier with the lack of a health bar being mentioned earlier on in this review, but Ico goes out of its way to ensure that you have very few instances in which you realise that you're simply playing a game. This does mean that the only times you'll really know there's a GUI at all are when you're in a cutscene and subtitles appear, when you're saving the game, when you're restarting because someone needed to call an ambulance, and when you're messing around in the pause menu. Otherwise, when you're running around, climbing on things or bonking shadows with a stick, you don't have anything to get in the way. This is all a part of an overriding principle Fumito Ueda espoused during the development of this game, known as design by subtraction, the deliberate removal of superfluous design elements to ensure a tight, exact video game by the end of it. When you look at video games today, there's a sort of standard across most action games where you'll have an elaborate heads-up display telling you any number of things such as your health, armour, ammunition, magic, stamina, hunger, thirst, minimap, time of day, objectives, tutorial messages, and all sorts of information that the game expects you'll need to be aware of at any given moment. Ico, by design, has no need for any of that. It doesn't benefit from many of these mechanics because the core design of the game is as a platformer in the vein of Prince of Persia and Another World, games which kept the additional mechanics and their presence strictly to where it was necessary. There is one mechanic I think could have been implemented, however: a map. Whilst I wouldn't consider it an essential addition to this game, I do think that a map would help to make it a little easier to remember where you came from. Perhaps Ueda thought similar, as he had a few regrets about this approach to designing the game, claiming he maybe went a little too far with the subtraction. This would likely explain why the combat is about as deep as a puddle of water on my kitchen counter when I spill some trying to fill the kettle. It would also likely explain the occasionally vague way forward, and how you're even meant to do anything unless you just try things. To put it another way, if Eco released today, you'd probably be seeing some yellow paint in places. With all of that said, however, I can't claim the idea behind Design by Subtraction was a mistake. It was well founded as a base on which to develop a game like this, even if the end product can occasionally cause the player to be a bit confused on where to go, what to do, and how to do it at times. Hell, I accidentally figured out swinging on the chains by pressing the circle button on a whim. However, it is at this point that I will be delving into spoilers for this game, so if you would like to skip this section, go to the conclusion chapter, or you can end the review here in the know that this is a game very much worth a look if you want a unique platforming experience. So the objective of the game is a simple one: open the gate back up, leave the castle, and return to the mainland from where you came. The opening the gate bit is a simple plan on the face of it, although it involved powering the gate with focused and reflected sunlight. Once the gate's unlocked, interacting with it will begin a cutscene in which Yorda reacts violently with the gate. As she collapses to the floor, the vast gate opens up to reveal the destination: the way home. A bridge extends from both ends of the valley, and the two can run, or more accurately saunter, along the bridge. At this point, the now weakened Yorda can't run very far anymore before she stumbles from exhaustion. It makes you realise just how long the bridge really is. At the middle of the bridge, however, a bolt strikes Eco and Yorda, and the bridge begins to retract. Eco, having nearly been thrown off the bridge, has to get back to Yorda. He jumps back across, and Yorda, with what strength she has remaining, catches hold of him, but he remains hanging off the ledge. The Queen's presence is felt on Yorda as she loses her strength, and unable to pull Eco up from the ledge, her grip fails and Eco is sent plunging into the valley below. Eco ends up on top of what looks like a cage suspended by a chain. There are several of these cages around, and they give Eco a route towards some solid ground. From there are more platforming puzzles to solve, some of it including some swimming we haven't really had to do before, until finally reaching a familiar chamber. It's the outside of the elevator to the prison. We make our descent, careful not to fall carelessly to the bottom, but unable to access the elevator itself, we go through the open door instead, which leads to the dock we landed at. Along the ridge, we find our way towards the sword that was used by the jailers at the start. So with it now in hand, we head back to the elevator and make our ascent. We see a petrified Yorda surrounded by these shadow creatures, and no matter what we do to interact with her, Yorda does not respond. Instead, we are left on our own to deal with these beasts. But the strange thing is, these beasts don't attack Eco. They hop around, fly about, and generally act like nuisances, but as each one is defeated, a sarcophagus lights up. The moment that every one of these beasts is killed, and every one of the sarcophagi are lit up, the way forward is opened to you. Up the stairs, past Yorda, and beyond the gate, lies an elevator to bring us to a massive throne room. Nothing seems to occupy it besides a couple movable statues, and not much is happening here. Attempt to leave, however, and the Queen appears, sitting on her throne. She explains her actions to Eco, saying she has become too old, but she plans to use her daughter Yorda as a vessel for her soul to live anew. Eco, naturally not thrilled about this, attempts to strike the Queen with the sword, but she deflects the attack, sending Iko flying. The impact of the collision breaks Iko's right horn, but undeterred, he regathers the sword and engages in combat with the Queen. This is where I have an admission to make. I thought I was doing something wrong for the majority of this fight. You see, I had it in my mind that my attacks did nothing because, well, I was losing the sword each time, and the battle didn't really change at any point except the final stage, as it were. I thought I was supposed to attack her from above or something and tried looking for ways up, but no, the strategy is disappointingly simple. Attack the Queen with the sword, get behind cover if you don't have the sword to avoid her blast attack, and regather the sword when you get a chance. Rinse, repeat. I realise this game wasn't really designed to have deep combat or anything, but as final encounters go, this is honestly quite disappointing, and easily one of the weakest parts of the game, in spite of the climax that it provides to the game once the final blow lands and the Queen is struck in the chest with the sword. In her dying breaths, she stresses to Iko that Yorda cannot leave the castle. She disappears and an explosive force sends Iko flying once more, this time crashing into the wall to lose not just his left horn this time, but also his consciousness. A reaction happens with the petrified Yorda, now resembling the shadow creatures they had been fending off all game, but as she approaches the throne room and picks Iko up, the castle begins to collapse around them, the intricate stonework crumbling to a ruin. Eventually, the Shadow Yorda brings Iko to the boat at the dock and pushes him away to the sea. As we see the castle falling to the sea, as Iko's boat drifts lazily along the water, and after the credits roll with a montage of all the happenings up to that point, he finally ends up ashore on a beach. Awake, he leaps out of the boat, though feeling a bit groggy, he flops awkwardly to the ground. Control returns to us and we can run around on the beach, but it becomes apparent that something is waiting some distance along on the beach. We run along for a minute, the tide racing towards the sand, and we eventually find Yorda? Motionless for a few seconds, she finally stirs and, following a whispered word from Yorda, we fade to black. That said, there is another ending. Sort of. Alongside the cliff face, you might come across some watermelons. Pick one up, carry one over to Yorda, and you'll be snacking on some juicy watermelon on the beach. Traditional Japanese fare on a summer's day. There were a few things I didn't end up going over in this review, such as the New Game Plus mode this game has, which provides a translation for Yorda's dialogue, as well as the ability for a second player to control Yorda. But all told, it would be best if I left much of the digging to the people who are much more familiar with this game than I am. I've left a couple accounts in the description who have a lot of things you can read up on. It's all pretty interesting. So with all of that, it's time to wrap things up. When all is said and done, despite its relatively meagre sales, Iko is an impressive platformer at a time where the cinematic platformer genre was, in some respects, dormant. It channeled a lot of what made the classics of the genre into something a bit more contemporary, and did so very well. There were moments where it could be a bit confusing on what you were meant to do and where you were meant to go, and some of the visual aspects might not be to everyone's taste, especially with how incredibly bright the game can be. Personally, however, I enjoyed playing this. It's a properly fun game because it leaves you to your own devices to figure things out much of the time, and it didn't make me feel lost enough to seek out a guide or anything. The combat being quite easy helps reduce the prospect of frustration, although I do wish it could have been a bit more in-depth than it ended up, even if it might run counter to the game's design. As for other versions of the game besides the PlayStation 2 original, there's only one option available. In 2011, Bluepoint Games worked with Japan Studio to develop the PlayStation 3 remaster of Iko. At that time, Bluepoint already had a good reputation with their remasters of the first two God of War games, whilst concurrently working on the also excellent Metal Gear Solid HD collection. The remaster of Iko was sold standalone in Japan, whilst over here in the West it sold alongside some other game nobody cares about. The HD remaster has a fair few interesting things about it, and I want to go over a few of them while I can. The remaster itself is based on the European release of the game, the latest of the original releases, which included a few features that didn't get added for the earlier North American release. First of all, the obvious change is the resolution and frame rate. Whilst the PlayStation 2 original runs at a 240p resolution and an inconsistent frame rate, the HD remaster is more than comfortable with running at 1080p at a rock-steady 30 frames per second. The massive increase in resolution in combination with the move to widescreen allows Ico to present itself in all its eerie splendour. There's a clarity to the image that the original version lacked owing to the reduced resolution, but it also enables the vast scale of the castle to feel somehow more tangible. So, what followed on from this game? Well, whilst Ico didn't succeed all that well in sales, it didn't come and go without some influence on other games. According to director Patrice Desilets, during the development of Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, the team at Ubisoft Montreal were encouraged to play Ico for an idea of what to do to make the game's mechanics work as tightly as possible. And of course, that's not even touching on the other games and even the developers that have been inspired by Ico over the years. It was instrumental in the design of The Last of Us, with the relationship between Joel and Ellie drawing heavily from that of Ico and Yoda, as well as the mechanical implications of that relationship. Its naturalistic aesthetic mixed with strange mystical forces inspired the visual design of games like Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, and even Dark Souls. And its mechanics inspired the works of film director turned video game designer Joseph Fares.
Okay, can you swear here?
Yes, that Joseph Fares.
Fuck the Oscars, you know?
Suffice it to say, if you've played games in the last 25 years since Ico's release, it's probable that you've played something that was in some way inspired by it. It may have failed to break 1 million units in its time, but Ico walked so that the many games it inspired could run. So let's talk language requirements. Due to the dialogue in this game not being Japanese, English, or really any language we speak in our daily lives, we have to rely on the subtitles to do the heavy lifting for us, which is a problem when Yoda's speech is subtitled with runic text. For this version, anytime you get legible text, it's in Japanese, so you'll need to know how to read it. The problem, however, is this typeface is a little difficult to read. It's unusually tall and the glyphs, especially kana, are exaggerated to make them more readable at the resolution the game is played at, but it doesn't entirely work. Fortunately, however, you don't necessarily need to worry about the dialogue. If anything, it probably adds to the mystery of the game's world. And from a gameplay standpoint, there isn't any dialogue in the game that carries any instructional significance. You can play the game without knowing much Japanese. If anything, it's in keeping with the game's themes. How's that for ludonarrative resonance? As far as importability is concerned, complete box copies are available from as little as 500 yen. So it's a pretty easy game to get a hold of for cheap if you don't mind going for a Japanese copy. Conversely, copies of the PAL release tend to start from around £20, so if you're budget conscious, you might want to look at a Japanese copy. Just be sure to buy it alongside some other games if you're importing. There is, however, another way to experience Ico without having to play it. In 2004, prolific author Miyuki Miyabe, best known at the time for works such as All She Was Worth and Brave Story, penned a novelisation called Ico: Castle in the Mist. It released with an English translation in 2011, courtesy of Alexander O. Smith on the Viz Media imprint Haikasoru. According to Miyabe, she had written it in such a way that it doesn't replace the original game, instead being her own spin on the game's narrative, and indeed it's a story that diverges from the original quite a bit. It's not unusual for an adaptation to go in its own direction at times. All the same, the reception towards the book suggests it's an approach that works here. Buying a physical copy of the book in English is neither easy nor cheap, as the book is currently out of print it would seem. But the Japanese version is available in both tankobon and 2-volume bunkobon variants, and you can still buy a digital version of the book in English via your ebook distributor of choice. So if you want a speculative reinterpretation of the original game, fill your boots. And that marks the end of this review. Ico is a game that deserves its place in history as an example of what the medium of video games can offer artistically. It struck a chord with the people who played it, and it enabled Sony to put their faith in what Fumito Ueda had up his sleeve for what he had coming up in just a few years since the release of Ico. If you have any suggestions on what I ought to cover, please let me know. I'm happy to take pretty much any recommendations you have. I also have other reviews you can check out, including reviews of the PlayStation 1 Ace Combat games, and most recently, Final Fantasy IV. There is also my Blue Sky in the description to keep up to date with everything that I'm up to. For now though, this has been Daniel Learmouth. Siddhi.